Police in Nassau County announced that DNA evidence has linked them to the man behind the 1974 murder of Barbara Waldman.
On January 11th, 1974, a 5-year-old boy walked through the front door of his house on Sally Lane in Oceanside, New York, after coming home from kindergarten. He went upstairs looking for his mother. He found her face down on the bedroom floor, hands tied behind her back with pantyhose, shot once. She was 31 years old, and he was the youngest of her 3 children. A neighbor saw a man leave the house in a fur-lined coat that morning, but didn't think anything of it. Detectives drew a composite sketch and lifted a clear fingerprint from inside the home. Both were circulated for years, and neither produced a match. The man who left that fingerprint wasn't in any database. By the time anyone put a name to him, the 5-year-old who found her was 57 years old. Her name was Barbara Waldman. She was 31 years old, a mother of 3, married to a dentist named Gerald Waldman. They lived in a colonial-style house in the 3900 block of Sally Lane in Oceanside, a residential hamlet on the south shore of Long Island in Nassau County. Oceanside in the early 1970s was a quiet, middle-class suburb with houses close together, small yards, and streets that ended in cul-de-sac. Gerald ran his own dental practice locally. Barbara stayed home with the 3 children, Marla, who was 7, Larry, who was 6, and Eric, who was 5. On the morning of Friday, January 11th, 1974, Gerald left for work, and the 3 children went to school. Barbara was home alone. At some point during the morning hours, a man entered the house. Investigators later determined that he came in through the front or side door. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact. Investigators believed he either found the door unlocked or that Barbara let him in. Doors in the neighborhood were commonly left unlocked during the daytime hours, especially in the mornings when children were at school. He sexually assaulted her in the upstairs bedroom. He tied her hands behind her back with pantyhose and stuffed a pillowcase into her mouth. Then he shot her once in the back of the head while she lay face down on the floor. He left the house and walked away. A neighbor saw a man leaving the area on foot, wearing a heavy jacket with a fur-lined hood. She noticed the coat, but at the time did not think anything of it. The house sat quiet on Sally Lane for the rest of the morning. Barbara's body lay on the bedroom floor while the neighborhood carried on with its Friday routine. Other mothers on the block went about their mornings. Mail was delivered, and cars came and went from driveways. Nobody knocked on the Waldman door. Nobody called the house that morning. The children were still at school, and Gerald was at his practice. Eric Waldman, the youngest of the 3 children, came home from kindergarten around midday. He was 5 years old. He walked inside the house alone, went upstairs looking for his mother, and found her lying on the bedroom floor. "I have had the image of my mom in my head since I was 5, Eric said decades later, "and it will not go away until I die." Nassau County Police homicide detectives responded to the house and processed the crime scene. The upstairs bedroom showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Barbara Waldman had been killed at some point that morning, in the hours between when Gerald left for his dental practice and when Eric came home from school. The house had not been ransacked. Nothing of value was missing from any room. The violence had been directed entirely at Barbara. Whatever brought the intruder to the Waldman home on Sally Lane that Friday morning, it was not robbery. Detectives recovered a fingerprint from inside the home that did not belong to anyone in the Waldman family. The print was clear, well-defined, and of high enough quality to be usable for comparison if a suspect could ever be identified. They also had the neighbor's description of the man she had seen leaving. A composite sketch was produced from her account and distributed to the public. It was published in local newspapers, distributed to area businesses, and posted on bulletin boards across the community. In the days and weeks that followed the murder, detectives canvassed Sally Lane and the surrounding blocks on foot. They interviewed Gerald, Barbara's family, her friends, her neighbors, and anyone who had been in the area that morning. Detectives checked whether any strangers had been reported on the block, whether any unfamiliar vehicles had been parked on the street, and whether any service calls had been scheduled at the Waldman home that morning. Tips came in from across Nassau County and the wider Long Island area over the following months. Each tip was investigated individually by the homicide detectives assigned to the case, checked against the known facts and the established timeline of the crime, and either pursued further or set aside. Detectives compared the fingerprint against known offender databases at the local, state, and federal level. The composite sketch was distributed to residents across Oceanside, the neighboring communities, and the wider Nassau County area. It was one of the most thorough investigations in the department's history, involving dozens of detectives over a period of months. None of it brought investigators any closer to identifying a suspect. After months of intensive investigative work, the fingerprint from the bedroom remained unmatched, and the man depicted in the composite sketch remained unidentified. Police investigated Gerald thoroughly. Over the course of multiple interviews with homicide detectives, he accounted for his whereabouts on the morning of the murder and cooperated fully with every request from investigators. He was never charged with any crime in connection with the murder. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime, and his alibi held up under scrutiny. The absence of charges did not stop the talk. In 1974, when a married woman was killed inside her own home, the husband was the first person investigators looked at and the last person the community stopped talking about. Neighbors in Oceanside whispered about Gerald for years. He was a dentist who walked into his office every morning knowing that some of the people sitting in his chair believed he might have killed his wife. 6 months after Barbara's death, Gerald remarried. He brought a stepmother into the household. For some in the community, the speed of the remarriage only deepened their doubt about him. He was raising 3 young children whose mother had been murdered in their own home, and people around him treated him with suspicion instead of support. That doubt never fully went away, even as the years passed and no charges materialized. As children, we heard many times that people were suspicious of our father and that he may have had something to do with our mom's murder, his daughter Marla said later. This powerful social mark of disgrace was heavy and hurtful to our family. Gerald Waldman lived under that weight for 32 years. He never once addressed the rumors publicly. Every day, he went to work, came home, and raised his children while the community around him made up its mind about what had happened on Sally Lane. Gerald died in 2006 at the age of 64, without anyone publicly clearing his name and without ever learning who had killed his wife. Marla Waldman was 7 years old when her mother was killed. She was the oldest of the 3 children and the one who remembered Barbara most clearly. She grew up in Oceanside, raised by her father and stepmother. Marla carried the memory of her mother and the absence of any answer from childhood into adulthood. She never stopped thinking about what had happened to her mother on Sally Lane. All 3 Waldman children grew up in the same house on the same street in Oceanside where their mother had been murdered. The case file sat in the Nassau County Police Department for decades. Detectives who inherited the case file reviewed the accumulated material periodically. Each time a new fingerprint database or new forensic technique became available, investigators ran the evidence through it, checking whether additional information could be extracted from the biological material. By the 1990s, DNA technology had advanced to the point where the crime scene samples from 1974 could finally be tested. A male DNA profile was developed from the biological material collected in 1974. Analysts entered it into CODIS, the FBI's database where crime scene DNA is automatically checked against the records of anyone who has been convicted and sampled. Nothing came back from the search. The fingerprint had been sitting in the case file for more than 20 years without a match. Now the DNA profile was doing the same thing. 2 different types of evidence, collected on the same morning from the same crime scene. Both pointed at a single unknown man who had never been processed by any law enforcement agency. After more than 2 decades of running every available tool and technique, the case was no closer to putting a name on the evidence than it had been on the day Barbara was killed. But Marla Waldman did not wait for the department to call. Starting in the years after the murder, Marla contacted the Nassau County Homicide Squad repeatedly. She pushed hard for the case to stay active, asked what new tools were available, and showed up at the precinct when her calls went unanswered. On her own time and with her own resources, Marla tracked down court records, property records, and old newspaper archives, searched public databases, and made calls to anyone she thought might have information. She wrote letters to the department, to elected officials, and to anyone who might be able to apply pressure. Over the years, she made herself impossible to ignore, and she did not stop until there was finally an answer. There were entire years when nobody at the department returned her calls, and stretches when the case was not actively being worked. For a long time, the forensic technology to do what she was asking did not exist. Marla kept the pressure on through all of it, because nobody else was going to do it for her. Marla's steady, repeated contact with the homicide unit kept her mother's name in front of the people who controlled the file. For the next 45 years, Marla was the reason the Waldman case never got filed away and forgotten. In 2024, 50 years after the murder, the department finally had access to the forensic technology Marla had been pushing for. Nassau County partnered with Othram, a private forensic genetics lab based in Texas, and submitted the biological evidence from the Waldman crime scene. The biological material had been sealed in evidence storage since January of 1974. Othram's scientists worked with the 50-year-old samples and managed to extract enough genetic material to build a profile detailed enough to search. The resulting profile was then handed off to the FBI's forensic genealogy team to begin the search. The FBI team took a different approach than CODIS. Instead of checking the profile against criminal records, they uploaded it to consumer ancestry databases, the kind that millions of Americans use to trace their family history. When a partial genetic match turned up among the results, genealogists used it to begin building a family tree. They worked outward from the connection, tracing relatives through public records until the tree pointed at a single family. The family was in Oceanside, New York. The man they were looking for had not come from some other city or state. He had been living right there, in the same community as the Waldman family the entire time. The man at the center of that family tree had lived in Oceanside in 1974. He worked as a sanitation worker for the town of Hempstead, collecting trash on the residential blocks of Oceanside and the surrounding area. His name had never appeared in the case file, and he had not been questioned at any point during the original investigation. He had 2 prior arrests, one for assault and one for possession of stolen property. Both arrests happened years before DNA collection became standard, and neither charge was serious enough to require a sample under New York law. His genetic profile had never been entered into any database. Marla learned the suspect's name before the public announcement. She immediately began researching where the man had lived and where he had worked, digging through local records and public databases. Through her own research, she managed to contact one of the man's adult daughters. The daughter agreed to cooperate. Over the course of several conversations, she sent Marla a number of old photographs of her father taken at different points in his life. One of the photographs stopped Marla cold. It showed the man wearing a coat with a fur-lined collar. The collar was thick, heavy, and sat high around the neck. It was the same style of coat depicted in the composite sketch from 1974, the sketch drawn from the neighbor's description of a man walking away from Sally Lane on the morning Barbara was killed. A sketch drawn from a neighbor's memory in 1974 and a photograph taken at a different point in the man's life depicted the same coat on the same person. Marla had found the connection between them herself, working entirely on her own. The DNA evidence and the 50-year-old eyewitness account converged on one man. His name was Thomas Generazio. Born around 1947, Generazio grew up in Oceanside and never left the area. At the time of the murder on Sally Lane in January of 1974, he was 26 or 27 years old. His job as a trash collector for the town of Hempstead took him through the neighborhoods of Oceanside on a regular weekly schedule. The routes covered the residential streets and cul-de-sacs of Oceanside and the surrounding communities. Working that route week after week, Generazio would have known which houses were empty during the day and which driveways cleared out by 9 a.m. He would have known which families had young children who left for school each morning. His fingerprints from those prior arrests existed somewhere in the law enforcement system. But in the decades before automated fingerprint identification was widely adopted across law enforcement, comparing a latent print from a crime scene to a specific person's booking prints required someone to know where to look. A detective would have had to already suspect Thomas Generazio by name and then specifically request a comparison between his booking prints and the latent from the crime scene. Nobody at the department had any reason to make that request because nobody knew his name. For more than half a century, the print from the crime scene and the man who left it existed in separate files in separate systems. Nobody in law enforcement had ever connected the two. Generazio died of cancer in 2004 at the age of 57, having lived his entire adult life on Long Island, in the same area where Barbara Waldman had been murdered 3 decades earlier. He was never questioned about the murder of Barbara Waldman or contacted by any detective who worked the case. For 3 decades after the murder, Generazio worked his collection routes through the same neighborhoods where Marla, Larry, and Eric grew up, and where Gerald ran his practice. The cloud of suspicion that hung over Gerald Waldman for 32 years had always belonged to the man who picked up their trash. On March 11, 2026, the Nassau County Police Department held a press conference at police headquarters. Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder stood at the podium and announced that Thomas Generazio had been identified as the person responsible for the 1974 murder of Barbara Waldman. The public announcement came 52 years after the crime, 22 years after Generazio's death, and 20 years after Gerald Waldman's death. Marla Waldman Kahn had been on a family vacation at the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri when the call came in from a detective at the Nassau County Police Department. She stepped away from her family and found a quiet spot before answering the phone. "We have a match," the detective told her over the phone. Marla dropped to her knees. At the press conference, Marla stood at the podium and addressed the room. She had been 7 years old the last time she saw her mother alive. She was now 59 years old, a wife and mother herself. For more than 4 decades, she had been pushing the department, researching on her own, and refusing to let the case be filed away. Happily today, 52 years later, I get to say to the world that our father is exonerated, Marla said. Gerald Waldman had died in 2006, a full 20 years before the identification was made. In the 32 years between the murder and his own death, Gerald never learned who was responsible. In all that time, not once did anyone stand in front of a microphone and say his name was clean. Gerald went to work every day, sat across from patients who whispered about him behind his back, raised his 3 children, built a second marriage, and carried the suspicion of his community for 3 decades. The man who actually killed Barbara Waldman had been living a few blocks from their home the entire time. "It is not about seeking legal punishment," Marla said. "It is an emotional, psychological resolution." Generazio had been dead for more than 20 years. There would be no trial and no sentencing. What the family received instead was an answer, a name, and the clearing of their father's reputation. Eric Waldman, the boy who had walked through the front door of his house and found his mother, was 57 years old at the time of the announcement. He had carried the image of what he found on that bedroom floor for 52 years. It had never once faded. He attended the press conference with Marla and their brother Larry, who had been 6 at the time of the murder. The 3 of them stood together at the very front of the room. They were the same 3 children who had lost their mother to a stranger on a Friday morning in January of 1974. They had waited more than half a century for someone to say the name out loud. A 5-year-old boy walking through the front door of his house on Sally Lane, going upstairs, and finding his mother on the bedroom floor. The man who put her there lived a few blocks away and was never asked about it. It took 52 years, a daughter who refused to stop looking, and a photograph of a coat to find his name. If this case stayed with you, leave your thoughts in the comments. More solved cases in the playlist.